Hello, Dr. Fixmaster here. I'm going to share with you a couple of neat ideas for keeping your Weedeater running happily and smoothly. There's just a couple of things that usually go wrong with these things, and I'm going to go over those. If all of a sudden your Weedeater does not start, a couple of things you want to check are the following. One is the diaphragm in your carburetor. Two, I'll explain these. Two are the hoses in your gas tank. If you look inside of your gas tank, applies to almost any small engine, you will see that there are a couple of hoses on the inside going in. One of them is an outlet from the carburetor, and one of them is an inlet from the carburetor, and it's very important. Of course, fuel has to get in there in order to be ignited in the engine and so that your motor runs. These hoses get old rather quickly. They get brittle as a result of being exposed to the gasoline for a long period of time. They only last for, I don't know, a year and a half before they get so brittle that they just break off. Quite often there's a filter that's maybe an inch long at the end of the hose, providing just a little weight on that hose, and it's very easy for that hose to break off in a place so that the hose isn't even down in the gasoline anymore. So one of the first things you should do if your Weedeater won't start, look into the gas tank, shine a light down in there, and make sure that your hoses are intact. Once that's checked and you see that that's good, I've actually had that happen to me a couple of times, so that's why I'm sharing it with you. Very common for that to go wrong. So once that's out of the loop, we move over to the carburetor. I'm going to show you how to disassemble this thing. It's very easy to do. In this case, this is a Weedeater Featherlight Plus, but many others are going to be similar. There's an air cleaner on the top. A couple of screws, let's just take these out. Take this cover off. You have a little air filter element inside, that can come off. All right, now we're looking inside the air filter housing, holder, whatever you want to call it. And you will see that there are a couple of hex key screws in here. So I'm just going to stick this in here and unwind them. Once you get these two hex key screws out, quite long, they go all the way through the carburetor. Once you get these off, you can remove the air filter cover from the carburetor and take the carburetor off. And you get to the diaphragm. Okay, so those are out. This filter cover can come off. Try not to jar anything, because there's washers and things that are better to keep in one place with that. So I'm going to gently set that on the table here. And now you have the carburetor, which is free to come loose. You can see that it's loose, it's free to move around. All you have to do is unplug these hoses right here. One is the outlet, one's the inlet. When you pump that primer bulb, one hose, it sucks fuel out of the tank, and the other one, it returns fuel back into the tank. You want to pump that a few times to make sure you got fuel in there, to make sure that you know when you're starting it that you've got fuel present at the carburetor. So, now we're at that point. I have sitting here on the table a duplicate of this, and I'm going to use that to show you the rest of this, which is what goes wrong in these over time, why it causes problems in starting your Weedeater. I'm going to leave this one right where it is, because I just replaced this today to take care of this problem, which has shown up several times in the 12 to 15 years that I've owned this Weedeater. Every once in a while, it's going to happen, and the sad thing is that people tend to have a problem like that, and they take their Weedeater to the garbage dump, when really all it is a very cheap part that just needs to be replaced, and it just takes a few minutes to do it. What I like to do is, because I've purchased another carburetor, I'll build this one, have it sitting on the shelf, so that at the very moment when this one goes bad, I can just swap them. My Weedeater still works. I can spend as much time as I want on this to order the new diaphragm, and I'm good to go. So I'm going to zoom in on this, take the camera off its stand, zoom in on this, and show you what it is about this setup that is the most error prone, what's the most likely thing to cause you to have trouble starting up your Weedeater. Here's the carburetor up close. On this side you have the diaphragm. On this side you have the primer bulb. Once in a while those primer bulbs will go out. If there gets a crack in it or anything, you push on it and the fuel squirts all over. You'll know when you need to fix that part. Most of the gaskets and things inside in the primer bulb have a longer lifespan than the worst culprit, the weak link in the system, which is the diaphragm. So I'm going to show you right here. The first thing, you got a cover. I'm going to flip that down. And the diaphragm is right underneath it. There's usually a gasket underneath the diaphragm. If I can get, hands are shaking a little bit. So what you see here is a gasket and a diaphragm. So I'm going to just peel this gasket away from the diaphragm. You're going to have to sort of remember, remember the order so you can put it back together correctly. But this diaphragm is some kind of, I'm not sure what kind of material it's made out of, but this is what they look like. And they're soft. They're supposed to be soft. And just like that. What happens over time is what happens when they're brand new. This material is very flexible, and there's a little valve down inside there where you can see. See if I can point it out to you. Right down there, right in the middle. That thing will, with the motion of the engine and the flow of the fuel, will bounce in and out, and it will push on this post on the diaphragm, and that motion will pump fuel out of the tank and into your carburetor, and so that your Weedeater can run. What happens over time is that this very soft, flexible material becomes kind of caramelized and stiff with age, and when it gets bad enough, you'll start having trouble starting it. Eventually it won't start at all, which is what I discovered today. It's February. I live in Arizona, so I was just trimming around the edges of the front lawn, and I couldn't get this thing started. I knew instantly what it was, so I swapped out my carburetor and off I went. But this, you can tell when you're pushing on this metal thing, you can even hear it in the video. It's crunchy. These things get crunchy, and when they get crunchy, they don't work anymore. It's a very cheap part, so when you get a new one, you'll see that these things are very soft and very flexible. They're not crunchy at all. When they're soft and flexible like that, they do their job properly. And it only takes about a year, maybe a year and a half, for fuel just sitting in these things for a long period of time. It crunches them up. It makes them stiff, and they don't work anymore. So don't go throwing your Weedeater away after a year and a half when it just quits running. Go get yourself a diaphragm kit. Do this 5-minute repair. Put it back together in the same order, and you're good to go. I have put my carburetor back on, put the cover back on, and I'm going to give you just a couple of tips for starting weed eaters when you've taken care of the diaphragm issues. This Featherlight Plus has been a little bit temperamental, even with a brand new carburetor, and I'll just share one trick. Sometimes if I come in here and I put this thing on its full choke position and I pull the starter 3 times and I get nothing, a lot of times what that does is it floods the engine, and then you have to wait for a half an hour before it starts. So my recommendation is to give it 3 pulls in the off position. If you get nothing, then increase the amount of choke you're giving it a little bit at a time. So this one only has a couple of settings, a half and full. So I just come up here at a half, pull it a few times. If I get nothing, then go to the full. That's what I've had the most luck with. I say that because just today when I put a new carburetor in here, I went straight to full choke because that's what the other one required, and I immediately flooded the engine. I had to let it sit. When I came back and tried it the next time, I started on this side, pulled it a few times with the new carburetor in there, and I could tell it was just getting ready to start wanting to. I was getting a couple of pops, and so I tried the half setting, and then it fired right up. Once I revved it a few times, take the choke off, and it should idle, and this one was idling perfectly. Works really well. The other thing that I think is important is if you mix large batches of 40-to-1 mix gas to oil, you can end up, by the time you get through all that gas, these things don't use that much gas, but by the time you get through all that gas, your fuel is getting pretty old. So because I've had trouble starting the Weedeater on occasion, and the age of your fuel is important, I've given up on mixing my own fuel, and I just buy these cans from Lowe's. They're pre-mixed. You got to make sure you get the kind with the right ratio that's for your machine. But I like this because they use high octane gas. It's easy. It's because it's pre-mixed. I'm getting it in small batches, so I know that the fuel I have isn't getting so old that it gums up my machine and makes things not work. And you know that fuel that gets gummy is basically death to these diaphragms. So just keep that in mind. So I'm just going to take this out. Just today I was trying to start it up, and I was pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling, and because of that diaphragm getting all caramelized and crunchy, it just wasn't starting at all. I swapped in a new diaphragm. I had another carburetor just like this, like I said, and I put the new diaphragm in there, or it had a new diaphragm in it, and boy, it runs beautifully now, so I'm going to demonstrate. I'm going to push the primer bulb a couple times. I'm going to leave that choke off, see how we do. Go into half choke. Go into full choke. Coming back to half choke. Okay, there we go. Leave the choke off and just start it again, just to demonstrate. That, my friend, is the diaphragm does for you. New diaphragms are good things. Happy fixing.